This is the blank page. Now, I took the liberty of putting the title in Death and Rebirth Comics and by Jay Wilburn because that's who I am and I claim my stories here. Very excited to see where this goes, so let's see what we can do with this. Tom Duffy, thank you for being here, man. Just in time. All right. How do I want to start this? He was always destined to die at work. If Dave Fisher realized what had happened to him when he collapsed next to his register at Fisher Books, he might have been okay with it. Alright, we'll say before he opened the store in 1948, he had worked in a foundry under one of his former commanding officers. There were all sorts of risks of death there. And though he was thankful for that job after the war, he certainly hated it too. Of course, his job for that was storming beaches and liberating camps. Right up until that day, Dave collapsed while clutching his chest. He remained surprised. He survived his long vacation across Europe. Alright, Dave lifted his head and still clutched his chest for a moment before he straightened his suit. Dying was always confusing, but Dave had particular trouble figuring out that he had passed. His body was still there, slumped and going cold. It wouldn't be discovered until one more customer entered the bookstore it wouldn't be discovered until one more customer entered the bookstore. A full hour after normal closing. His wife would be informed later, and that, not surprised, her husband had stayed late. His kids were grown by that day in 1964, and they wouldn't find out about their dad until the following days. Dave Fisher, his spirit anyway, wandered between the shelves for several days and nights. It's getting slow, he kept saying. The passage of time was confusing too. He only just began to realize something bigger was amiss when he spotted the front windows soaked over and the sign turned to closed, even though it was broad daylight. He wasn't a cursing man, not since he left the service and cut back on his drinking. But he let a few choice words fly when he saw the condition of his windows. Why would kids do that? The locked door refused to give. He tried to turn the latch from the inside a few times. He tried to turn the latch from the inside a few times, but his fingers kept slipping off. He managed to get the door to rattle in its frame once, and then a second time. This was over the course of a few hours, but Dave didn't feel the passage of that time. Not all ghosts were capable of those little interactions with the physical world. Wasn't much, though. Any passerby would have chalked it up to the wind, even though everyone in town knew that Dave had passed away weeks ago inside. He tried once more to force the door. Business was hard enough without having your windows covered and your door locked during the workday. Never mind that it was now almost sundown. Never mind, it was now almost sundown, and the owner was dead. This time, the door did not rattle, but his hand, as he perceived it, slipped through the solid glass. He felt it like a blade through bones and veins of his wrist. It hurt like hell. Alright. Let me make this a new paragraph here. There we go. It hurt like hell. It shocked him out of his selective blindness as well. None of the physical sensation was real, as his hand, wrist, the rest of his body, and even the suit he still thought he wore, are now under the dirt 11 miles away. He drew his fingers outside the door, grew numb. Pain traveled in both directions. The cold outside was so deep as to burn like a freezer. It instantly reminded him terrible winter back during the war. Dave drew his hand to his chest and felt raking agony as he passed, as it passed through the door again, through the glass again. He rubbed the back of his aching knuckles and stepped away from the door as if the thing had stung him. He turned and really looked at his store. The shelves were empty. Canvas, let's say, canvas sheets that covered some of them had slipped off to puddle upon the unswept floor. A few books remained stacked in spots as if forgotten. Dave approached slowly and examined the torn cover of one. In 1964, he still had mostly hardbacks. That's a first edition. Why would you leave it like this? He scanned the room and saw and spied the discolored square on the counter where the register used to be. He breathed out his wife's name, and then each of his sons in the order of their birth. While he did this, he thought about collapsing on the counter, I'll say on that counter, what felt like moments ago to him. But now he darkly realized it had been longer. The pain in his hand, even as it subsided, reminded him of the crushing agony in his chest. The pain in his hand, even as it subsided, reminded him of the crushing agony in his chest. Say that had traveled down his arm. My father went the same way. He let out another breathy curse. Dave looked over the empty shelves again. He had vague memories of his wife, two of his sons. He had vague memories of his wife, two of his sons, and some friends from church unloading the shelves. He had not registered what any of that meant at the time. "I'm dead," he said out loud. At least it felt out loud to him. He waited, expecting his body to turn to vapor, to either ascend or descend to the next level, as his works in life might have dictated. But it appeared that the revelation alone was not enough to move him on. When he turned forward, he found the windows boarded over as opposed to soaked. Time had slipped by again. Dave remembered he had grandchildren on the way. What a shame he would never get to hold them. What a shame his wife had to go on alone. She was still relatively young. She'd probably remarry, but he didn't want to think about that. How long? Getting no answer. He approached the door. The only signs of daylight were harsh slivers Redeeming get Jay to tell a fun fact. All right, hold on just a moment. The only signs of daylight were harsh slivers that passed between the boards. Along the edges of the boards. All right. All right, a fun fact. Let's see what we got here. All right. I don't drive anymore, but I had a Honda Civic that was early 2000s model that I continued to drive for a good while. It was paid off years ago, but of course at that point that's when all the money that would normally go into a car payment goes into repairs. And every time we would have to get something repaired, we'd have to decide, okay, is it worth it to get this repaired, or do we just junk the car at this point? And so we went on and on. I didn't really take good care of my car in the sense of like I didn't wash cars, I didn't vacuum my car out or any of that kind of stuff. So it would gather pollen on it and I wouldn't get it off, and then it would just kind of be grungy. And I actually had somebody that was handling some scrap metal next door to one of our neighbors. Next door is kind of relative where we are living out in the woods, but one of the guys walked over and asked if we were going to junk the car, but it was still the car I was driving. The window had the power window had kind of broken and wouldn't stay up. So like I kind of had to push the window up, and I started using duct tape to hold the window closed. One time I got pulled over to get a ticket, and I had to roll down the window behind me and ask the officer if it was okay if I opened my door because I couldn't get my window down. He let me off without a ticket. I guess he figured a guy that has his window closed with duct tape probably doesn't need to be paying for tickets or whatever. And so we had to get some engine work done on it, like all the regular maintenance I hadn't done in a long time. So spark plugs and all that kind of stuff. And my wife asked about the window, and I said, don't worry about that. It's already going to be expensive. Just don't worry about the window. And then she told the guys to do the window anyway, so the window worked after that, which of course is the right choice. But we spent a lot of money on the car at that point because basically we were doing all the basic maintenance that you would normally do over a period of time. Of course, more things got wrong with it, and eventually we got rid of it anyway. And I'd gotten to a point where just cognitive and stuff like that, I really didn't need to be driving anymore anyway. So we ended up getting rid of the car. But for a number of years after that, we kept getting Christmas cards from the place that we had all that work done. And you've spent too much money at a mechanic when they start sending you Christmas cards. So that's my fun fact. I don't miss that car at all, and I don't really miss driving. Obviously, there's a convenience issue, not being able to drive, but it's cheaper just to have the one car, and if I'm not driving anyway, then it doesn't really matter. So that's the fun fact for today. For a long time, I kept that window closed with duct tape, so that's my redneck bona fides there, I guess. All right, getting no answer. Thank you. Getting no answer, he approached the door. The only signs of daylight were harsh slivers that passed through the edge of the boards. Dave bent down and brought his eye close to one of those gaps. He still recognized most of the businesses outside. The car models had not changed much. He decided it might just be months after his death, maybe a year at the outside. Okay, it was a little difficult to focus his vision. His view of the world sometimes doubled his view of the world, let's say out there. Sometimes doubled and tripled. It was suddenly dark again, and the streetlights spilling pale glow over the deserted downtown made him sad. Dave turned to see in the dim interior that even the shelves had been removed at this point. This was now a deserted, abandoned building. He supposed he knew that his sons had found better work on their own. That was... Okay, hold on. Let me add a word in. I missed there. On their own. That was the dream he had for them, wasn't it? Maybe he thought he'd live long enough. Maybe he thought he'd live long enough to pass this on to his then unborn grandchildren. Dave Fisher, not moving on from the abandoned building, stood and waited. He wasn't sure what he waited for, though. Alright. I don't know if that first section is too long, but I'm going to leave it for now. Dave got better about keeping track of time. It still slipped past him in chunks on occasion, but he was pretty good about catching back up with what he missed. Of course, it helped that Parker Hardware moved into the space in 1965. Dave liked Tony Parker. He never served, but Dave was sure had he met Tony in life that they could have been friends. Tony stayed late to catch up on work as well. Sometimes Tony's wife, Alice, did I use Alice? Yeah. And his daughter, Millie, came in to help. Tony welcomed them, but also insisted they go live their lives. That was what he worked for. That was his dream for them. All right. All right, that was his dream for them. I keep using his name at the beginning. Tony was a good guy. Dave had a hunch about what would happen to Packer Hardware once it was Tony's time to move on. One night, Tony sat over his books, say his account books in the back under a shallow light. Dave took the liberty of watching over the living man's shoulder. I know it seems tough, Dave said, knowing at this point he couldn't be heard. But you run a good business. You have loyal customers. You're good to them. You'll weather this storm, old friend. Let's say Dave thought he might be overstepping, but it probably didn't matter. It probably didn't matter since no one could hear him anyway. But that night, Tony Packer did turn off the light and go home. Dave assumed the man went home. He could have been going to a bar to drink away his sorrows. Dave hoped not, mostly for Alice and Millie's sake. So he spent a long time staring out the front window of the hardware store and businesses that were slowly changing into names he did not recognize. As he watched the town evolve before him, he thought about his own family again. His wife never visited the hardware store. He started to wonder if she might have moved away to start a new life. Maybe a new life with someone else. The new kid was stealing from Tony Packer, and it pissed Dave off to no end. He actually tried to punch the little punk more than once and failed. One time, the kid scratched at his neck after one of Dave's haymakers. That probably meant nothing, though. Then he tried something else. The kid is stealing from you, he whispered in Tony's ear. Day after day. It was maybe a week later that Dave noticed Mr. Packer watching closer. A few days after that, the kid was caught and dismissed. A couple nights after that, the brick came through the front window and passed, came through the front window, passed right through Dave's form, along with jagged shards of the glass. Dave actually tried to chase after the laughing thugs outside, but even with the window gone, he found himself incapable of passing through. Tony could hardly afford to replace it, but he did. Tony could hardly afford to replace it, but he did. They never pinned it on the kid, as far as Dave could tell. Alright. There were other setbacks as well, but none as big as the day Tony Packer collapsed in the floor one morning. Several people rushed to his side, including unseen Dave Fisher. All right. Okay, including unseen Dave Fisher. Tony was quite old at that point. He'd had bypass surgery, and Millie had watched the store for the weeks of his recovery. He did not recover from this one. For a number of days, Dave kept expecting Tony Packer to show up as a ghost. As a ghost too. He had died in the store, after all. Dave was still here. It just stood to reason. But Dave remained alone. As the single haunting spirit of this address. Staring out the window and thinking about it, brought him little comfort. It was 1982 at this point. And he recognized nothing out there. Alice and Millie worked to keep the store open. Dave was proud of them. wondered if Tony could see them and all they did for his legacy from wherever he was. He wondered if Tony could see them and all they did for his legacy wherever he was. Maybe he was here too. But ghosts just couldn't see each other. Dave had never observed another ghost as far as he knew. He tried his best to speak encouragement to the Packer ladies. Times had changed. There were large chain stores to compete with. Dave was kind of glad he didn't live long enough to have to deal with that. They finally had to close the place in 1984. He hardly blamed them, but was sad to see the place go. He had kind of felt a partial ownership of the store after all these years. Not to mention that it was lonely once the place was empty again. It was hard to track time like this. He wondered if he'd ever be free. He wondered if his wife was still alive, what his kids were doing, what kind of people his grandkids that he never met turned into. The comic store opened in 1986. In the late spring of 1986. When he learned the name of the new store was Fisher Comics, Dave was sure it was one of his sons or grandkids who took the place over. Art Spire was no relation, though. Not unless Dave had Jewish heritage. He was utterly unaware of. Let's see. Things had been tough in town for Jewish businesses in Dave's day. That bothered him on a deep level. Dave would have never described himself as a liberal or a progressive. Those words had slightly different meanings in his time, but he had fought a war against that sort of nastiness. He had walked through camps where hell had bled out on earth. He suffered nightmares the rest of his life from it, and even in death he remembered it still. Seeing that same hatred playing out at home made him feel ashamed. Art seemed to get along fine. He was jovial and remembered customers' names. Let me fix this. This needs to be plural possessive. Customers' names. Dave would have described Art as bookish. Nerd, I'll say nerdy, was the word for it today. At first, Dave thought he might be quite helpful if he could get through to Art. Dave had been a bookstore owner, after all, and it turned out that Art Spire named his store after after, let's say, Dave's original business in the spot. Inside was a framed picture, and the outside of the store looked quite similar to Dave's original facade. A real tribute. Well, let me make that a comma. A real tribute. But Dave Fisher was lost in the world of comics. They had existed in his time, of course, but they had existed in his time, of course. Existed in his time, of course, but nothing like this. There were more heroes. Many of them had multiple books. People paid big for the old comics in good shape. Alright. What kid ever kept a comic in good shape? Some were sealed in plastic. Never to be opened. And the way they depicted female hero characters, it was practically smut. Dave spent years just sort of turning in circles, watching all the color along the shelves blur past his vision. Let's say blur through. As more and more titles flew on and off the shelves. Then Art started selling more toys than comics. After that came card games. Dave didn't understand. After that came card games Dave didn't understand, and Art held tournaments in the store at night. Dave tried to pick up on the rules, but eventually gave up. Business dropped off, and before Dave knew it, Fisher Comics closed for good in 1992. Another business with the Fisher name had gone under. As far as he knew, Art Spire had survived, at least. All right. Okay. My wife sent me a message, so I'm going to check that real quick. All right. All right, sounds good. Okay. I believe my mom is here. I'm going to finish this story up and then call it a day. A video store. Dave said out loud, from his perspective, again. A video store, Dave said out loud from his perspective again. He was still trying to wrap his head around the concept. Hightower Video opened in 1993. It appeared that movies could be obtained in boxes and then watched at houses. Sometimes the kids working the store would play movies over televisions mounted from the ceiling. Dave still pictured families using theater style projectors in their living rooms. As this store started to struggle, Dave empathized, but had no concept how to help. The business model made 0 sense to him. when Hightower Video finally closed and Billy Hightower moved on to other things, Dave wasn't surprised. He braced himself for another long wait in the midst of all those video shelves, but he had no idea how long it would be. All right. (2016). Dave Fisher was at a loss. He could hardly fathom the date. This deep into a new century. He didn't exactly feel cursed, but he did feel lost, to say the least. That was even before he tried to understand the business, the new business. Juice House Vape. What did that even mean? Were they selling the liquid, the pipes? Was it tobacco? Was it just the steam that it appeared to be? Was this the new century's version of an opium den? Dave had no idea. The guy who ran it was called Chili. Was that a name? A title? The customers almost seemed to be speaking another language. Even the words he knew, he could barely understand with their strange accents. Was English going away? Was this linguistic drift? Would he soon find himself an alien in the place that used to be his store, say his bookstore. Something happened in 2020. Chili still ran the place, but wore a mask like a doctor. Dave assumed it was a fashion statement of the day. Chili kept the place up, but was constantly closed that year. Others outside wore those masks as fashion too. Dave started to believe he was seeing ghosts wandering the streets out there, but he couldn't be sure. Chili finally shuttered the place in 2021. Death and Rebirth Comics opened in 2022. Let's say early 2022. Dave braced himself to be even more lost than before. But the new owner set the place up much like a bookstore. There were still games and toys. There was also a coffee shop. Some people still wore the doctor masks, but that fashion appeared to be going out of style. Josh Fisher. Dave wondered. Wasn't an uncommon name, but he made sure to listen in on Josh's conversations to see if he could find anything out. One day, Josh's girlfriend was there, and they discussed the building belonging to to Josh's great-grandfather. Dave Fisher had no physical heart anymore, but he still felt it skip a beat. It had been a long trip around, but finally one of his children, like one of his descendants, had made good by the place. Dave hoped this one lasted longer than some of the others. He wasn't sure what he could do to help that, but this was family. And he intended to do right by them. He looked toward the window and through at other businesses and cars he no longer recognized. Instead of dwelling on the outside he could never reach, Dave focused on the work Josh Fisher put into making this place inside fine again.